Ever feel like, the world's just spinning out of control?
Yeah.
Like everything's changing faster than you can even keep up with it.
Yeah.
Well, imagine living through a time when, pandemics were raging.
Right.
Cities were exploding in size.
Wow.
And all those traditional ways of life were being turned upside down.
Yeah.
That was India in the 5th century BC, the time and place where Buddhism was born.
It's incredible to think about, isn't it? And what's even more fascinating is that out of all this turmoil came a philosophy focused on, finding peace within. It's a story that speaks to the human desire for meaning and tranquility.
Right.
Even in the face of, these immense challenges, something I think we could all relate to.
Absolutely. So today we're taking a deep dive into the origins of Buddhism.
Okay.
Exploring the life of the Buddha and those revolutionary teachings that still resonate thousands of years later.
And what makes this deep dive particularly interesting is that we're not just going to cover the basic facts. We'll also unpack why this ancient story still matters today. We'll explore how those teachings can offer guidance and solace in a world that often feels as chaotic as the one the Buddha himself lived in.
Okay, so to really understand the impact of Buddhism, we need to first set the stage.
Yeah.
What was life like in ancient India before the Buddha came along?
Well, imagine a world dominated by the Vedic culture, a highly ritualistic system that had been around for centuries.
Okay.
Think elaborate sacrifices chanting and a powerful priestly class known as the Brahmins.
So very structured and hierarchical society?
Precisely.
Much different from what we're used to today.
And for a long time, the system worked.
Right.
But as we mentioned, by the 5th century BC, things were starting to shift.
Okay.
Think of it like tectonic plates moving. The pressure was building and cracks were starting to appear.
What kind of cracks are we talking about?
Well, for one, new social classes were emerging. Merchants and bankers were gaining wealth and influence, challenging the traditional authority of the Brahmins. On top of that, global connections were expanding.
Right.
Trade routes brought new ideas from places like Persia and Greece, shaking up the existing worldview.
So it was a time ripe for disruption. A bit like our own era in some ways.
It was.
And into this world of change and uncertainty enters Siddhartha Gautama,
Yes.
the man who would become the Buddha.
Now here's where the story takes a turn that I always find fascinating.
Okay.
Siddhartha wasn't some poor farmer or struggling merchant looking for a better life.
Right.
He was born a prince.
Wow.
His father, a king, ruled over a prosperous clan in the Magadha region.
Talk about privilege. You'd think he'd be content with that life.
Right, and his father certainly tried to ensure that he shielded Siddhartha from suffering, surrounding him with luxury and keeping him sheltered from the harsh realities of life.
I see.
The king hoped this would deter his son from pursuing a spiritual path.
It's like that classic story of a parent trying to protect their child from the world.
Yes.
Only to have it backfire spectacularly.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happened.
Oh, no.
Despite his father's best efforts, Siddhartha couldn't be shielded forever.
Makes sense.
At the age of 29, he ventured outside the palace walls and encountered what are known as the Four Sights.
Okay, I've heard of the Four Sights.
Yeah.
Fill me in on why they were so significant.
Imagine for the first time encountering an old, frail person, then a sick person,
Okay.
and then a corpse.
Wow.
Finally, he saw an ascetic, a wandering holy man who had renounced worldly possessions.
Talk about a reality check. That must have been a profound experience.
It was a turning point.
Yeah.
These encounters shattered Siddhartha's sheltered worldview and exposed him to the stark realities of suffering, impermanence, and the spiritual quest for something beyond the material world.
It's like the bubble burst.
Yeah.
And he couldn't go back to living in blissful ignorance anymore.
Exactly. And this is where Siddhartha's story really gets interesting.
Okay.
He doesn't just shrug it off or try to bury those uncomfortable feelings.
Right.
He makes a radical decision.
Really?
He leaves his life of luxury, his wife and his newborn son, to seek answers to the questions that were now consuming him.
Wow. That's a serious commitment. It makes you wonder what was going through his mind and what he was hoping to find.
That's what we'll delve into next.
Okay.
Siddhartha's journey takes him down many paths, from studying with renowned teachers to embracing extreme asceticism. But it's ultimately through his own experiences and insights that he forges a new way of understanding suffering and the path to liberation.
I'm hooked. Let's dive into that journey and uncover those revolutionary teachings that would come to define Buddhism and impact millions of lives across millennia.
So Siddhartha sets off on this quest for truth, seeking guidance from various ascetic communities.
Okay.
These were groups of people who practiced extreme self-denial, believing that by punishing the body, they could somehow liberate the spirit.
It's interesting how this idea of self-denial as a path to spiritual growth pops up across different cultures and traditions.
It's a recurring theme for sure.
Yeah.
And Siddhartha really went all in,
Okay.
pushing himself to the limits.
Wow.
He meditated for hours, barely ate or slept, and subjected himself to all sorts of physical hardships.
But it sounds like this approach didn't quite lead him to the answers he was looking for.
It was a crucial part of his journey, though.
Okay.
He realized that while extreme asceticism could suppress desire,
Right.
it didn't lead to true liberation.
Yeah.
In fact, it was actually a form of attachment, a clinging to the idea of suffering as a necessary path to enlightenment.
It's like he was trading one form of attachment for another, still caught in a cycle of craving and aversion.
Exactly, and this realization is a turning point.
Okay.
He recognizes that the path to enlightenment lies not in extremes, but in moderation, in finding a middle way between indulgence and self-denial.
This idea of middle way seems central to Buddhism.
It's a key principle that runs through all of the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah.
It's about finding balance, cultivating awareness, and making choices that lead to greater well-being for ourselves and others.
So he abandons the path of extreme asceticism. What happens next?
There's this beautiful story about how, after years of intense practice and self-denial,
Okay.
Siddhartha is offered a bowl of rice porridge by a young girl.
Right.
He accepts it, realizing that nourishment is not an indulgence, but a necessity for a healthy body and mind.
It's like a simple act of kindness helped him reconnect with his humanity.
Yeah.
To see the true strength doesn't come from punishing the body, but from nurturing it.
Precisely. And this experience leads him to a profound realization.
Okay.
He decides to sit beneath a Bodhi tree and meditate until he achieves enlightenment.
Okay, here's where the story gets really interesting. Tell me about this enlightenment experience.
It's often depicted as a moment of sudden revelation,
Right.
but it's actually the culmination of years of intense practice and self-inquiry.
I see.
Siddhartha confronts his inner demons, symbolized by the demon Mara, who represents temptation, doubt, and everything that holds us back from achieving liberation.
It's like a final test.
Yeah.
A battle for his soul before he can reach true understanding.
Exactly. And through his unwavering focus,
Right.
his mindfulness, and his refusal to give in to fear or desire, Siddhartha overcomes Mara's attacks and achieves enlightenment.
Wow.
From this point forward, he becomes known as the Buddha, the awakened one.
So he's finally found the answers he was seeking. What happens next? Does he keep this knowledge to himself, or does he share it with the world?
The Buddha's enlightenment isn't just about personal liberation.
Right.
It's about realizing the interconnectedness of all things and the potential for all beings to awaken to this truth.
So he sees it as his mission to share this understanding and help others break free from suffering.
Exactly. And his first students are the very ascetics he had previously practiced with.
Interesting.
He begins teaching, sharing his insights into the nature of suffering and the path to liberation.
So what are these groundbreaking teachings? What's the essence of his message?
The core of Buddhism is encapsulated in the Four Noble Truths.
Okay, I've heard of the Four Noble Truths, but I admit I've always been a bit fuzzy on the details. Can you break it down for me?
Absolutely. The first noble truth is that life is suffering.
Okay.
This doesn't mean that life is all doom and gloom, but it acknowledges that pain, loss, disappointment. These are all inherent parts of the human experience. We all get sick, we all age, we all face loss and separation.
That was pretty relatable. I think we all know that feeling.
The second noble truth delves into the cause of suffering.
Okay.
It states that suffering comes from craving and attachment.
Right.
We cling to things, to people, to ideas, and this clinging creates suffering because everything is impermanent.
It makes sense. The more we grasp, the more we have to lose, and the more it hurts when we do.
Now here's where it gets hopeful. The third noble truth states that we can end suffering by ending craving. This doesn't mean we have to deny ourselves pleasure or live a life devoid of joy.
Right.
It's about recognizing the impermanent nature of everything and loosening the grip of attachment.
That's a big ask. How do we actually do that?
That's where the fourth noble truth comes in. It offers a solution.
Okay.
The path to ending suffering is the Eightfold Path.
Right.
It's like a roadmap, a set of guidelines for living a life of ethical behavior, mental discipline, and ultimately achieving a state of nirvana. the extinction of suffering.
So it's not just a philosophy to ponder, it's a way of life, a set of practices to cultivate.
Exactly. The Eightfold Path isn't about blind faith or dogma. It's about understanding the true nature of reality and making choices that lead to greater freedom and well-being.
Tell me more about this Eightfold Path. What are the specific steps involved?
It's broken down into 3 sections.
Okay.
Wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline.
Okay.
Wisdom is about understanding the true nature of reality, seeing things as they are without delusion. It involves right understanding and right thought.
So it's about developing a clear and honest perspective on ourselves and the world around us.
Precisely then comes ethical conduct,
Okay.
which encompasses right speech, right action, and right livelihood.
Okay.
This is about living in a way that minimizes harm,
Right.
promotes compassion, and considers the well-being of all beings.
So being mindful of our words, our actions, and even how we make a living.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that our choices have consequences not just for ourselves, but for others.
Exactly. And finally, we have mental discipline,
Okay.
which involves right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration.
Okay.
This is where meditation and cultivating mental focus come in.
It sounds like a holistic approach addressing our inner and outer worlds, recognizing that they're interconnected.
And the beauty of the Buddha's teachings is that they're rooted in personal experience.
Yeah.
He didn't claim to be a god or a prophet, but a human being who discovered a path out of suffering and wanted to share it with others.
This approach makes it feel accessible, suggesting that anyone, regardless of their background, can achieve enlightenment through their own efforts.
Exactly. The path is open to all. And this message resonated deeply with those who felt disenfranchised by the rigid Vedic system,
All right.
which often favored the elite.
So the Buddha's teachings were seen as more democratic,
They were.
offering a path to liberation that wasn't dependent on social status or priestly authority.
And this accessibility played a key role in the spread of Buddhism.
Okay.
He spent the rest of his life, about 45 years,
Wow.
traveling and teaching, sharing his insights and guiding others along the path.
It must have been quite a journey, walking all over ancient India, spreading his message. What kind of impact did his teachings have during his lifetime?
He attracted followers from all walks of life, merchants, farmers, kings, and even members of the Brahmin caste. His message of self-transformation, compassion, and mindfulness offered a compelling alternative to the prevailing social and spiritual norms.
It's amazing to think that this movement, which would go on to impact millions of lives across millennia, started with one man's quest for truth.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the power of ideas and the human desire for connection and meaning.
And here's another fascinating aspect, too. The Buddha's death wasn't seen as an end, but a beginning.
Really?
His followers,
Yeah?
organized into the Sangha or monastic community, continued to preserve and spread his teachings. They became the living legacy of his message, ensuring its survival and evolution.
So the Sangha acted as a kind of torchbearer, carrying the flame forward.
Yes.
But how did they manage to maintain the integrity of his teachings in a world without printing presses or the internet? I imagine there was a risk of things getting lost or distorted over time.
That's a great question, and it takes us into the realm of oral transmission, meticulous memorization, and the dedication of countless individuals to preserve the Buddha's words.
This sounds like a story in itself. How did they ensure that the essence of his teachings wouldn't be lost or diluted over generations? It's mind-blowing to think about how these teachings were passed down without the technology we have today. It makes you appreciate the dedication of those early followers.
It really does imagine a world where knowledge lived primarily in the minds and memories of people.
Yeah.
The early Sangha took this responsibility incredibly seriously. They developed sophisticated techniques for memorizing and reciting vast amounts of information.
So it was like a giant collaborative memorization project.
Exactly. They would gather regularly, sometimes in caves or forests, and recite the Buddha's teachings, ensuring that every word, every nuance was preserved accurately.
It sounds almost like a form of meditation in itself.
Right.
This intense focus on preserving the words.
Well, you could definitely see it that way. And it wasn't just about rote memorization.
Right.
There was also a deep understanding of the meaning behind the words, a commitment to embodying the teachings in their own lives.
So it was about living the philosophy, not just memorizing it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this lived experience helped to shape the way they interpreted and transmitted the teachings. They weren't just passive vessels of information, but active participants in shaping the tradition.
This makes me think about how different interpretations and schools of thought emerged within Buddhism, Was this diversity already present in the early Sangha, or did it develop later?
Even during the Buddha's lifetime, there were variations in how his teachings were understood and practiced. He encouraged his followers to question,
Mm-hmm.
to explore, to find their own path to liberation.
Interesting.
He didn't want to create a rigid, dogmatic system.
So he encouraged critical thinking and personal exploration, which is fascinating.
It was essential to his approach. He saw the path to enlightenment as a journey, not a destination.
Right.
And different people would inevitably find their own way,
Yeah.
their own unique expression of the teachings.
This approach seems very much in line with the idea of the middle way,
It is.
adapting to individual needs and circumstances rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And this flexibility, this openness to diversity, has been one of Buddhism's strengths throughout its history. It's allowed it to adapt to different cultures,
Right.
to evolve and remain relevant across time and space.
Speaking of evolving, I'm curious about how Buddhism eventually went from being an oral tradition to having written scriptures.
Yeah.
When and how did that transition happen?
That's a great question, and it takes us into the realm of historical detective work.
Okay.
For several centuries, the Buddha's teachings were passed down orally, but around the 1st century BCE.
Okay.
They were finally committed to writing in what's known as the Pali Canon.
So it was a long time before they were actually written down.
Centuries, in fact, and there are various theories as to why this transition occurred.
Like what?
Some scholars believe it was due to the threat of the teachings being lost,
Right.
or distorted over time.
Yeah.
Others suggest it was linked to the growing patronage of Buddhism by kings and rulers who saw the value in having a written record of the teachings.
It's like the printing press of the ancient world. Having a written text would have made it much easier to disseminate the teachings and standardize interpretations.
Exactly, and the Pali Canon became the foundational text for Theravada Buddhism, one of the major branches of the tradition that flourished in Southeast Asia.
This makes me wonder about how Buddhism spread beyond India. Was it mainly through those trade routes we talked about earlier?
Trade played a significant role, especially along the Silk Road, which connected India to Central Asia, China, and beyond.
Right.
Merchants and travelers carried not just goods, but also ideas and beliefs.
So it was like a cultural exchange with Buddhism weaving its way into the tapestry of different societies.
And as it spread, it encountered different languages, customs, and philosophical systems. This led to translations, adaptations, and the emergence of distinct regional variations of Buddhism.
Wow.
It's a fascinating story of cross-cultural pollination.
This has been an incredible journey through the origins of Buddhism. We've covered so much ground, from the Buddhist life and those groundbreaking teachings to the dedication of the early Sangha and the spread of Buddhism across cultures.
It's a story that continues to unfold even today. Buddhism's message of compassion, mindfulness, and the pursuit of liberation from suffering remains as relevant now as it was thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how those ancient teachings can offer guidance and solace in our own modern world, which often feels as chaotic and uncertain as the one the Buddha lived in.
It's a reminder that while the external world may be constantly changing, the path to inner peace lies in cultivating awareness, compassion, and wisdom. These are timeless qualities that can help us navigate the challenges of life and find greater meaning and purpose.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of Buddhism. We hope you've gained some new insights and a deeper appreciation for this rich and multifaceted tradition.
And remember, the journey of exploration doesn't end here. There's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to experience on the path to understanding ourselves and the world around us. Subscribe to The Deep Dive for more journeys into fascinating topics and discover the world's hidden knowledge.